Hello everyone. Here's my question. Does the level of CO2 in the air influence the temperature of the air? I've heard a lot about this in the media, so I decided to see if I could devise an experiment that would give me the answer. I purchased two CO2 meters. I labeled them Unit A and Unit B. Here you can see the units on my desk in my office. Unit A shows 709 parts per million of CO2, and Unit B shows 663 parts per million of CO2. So the units appear to be fairly accurate with each other, with a discrepancy of less than 100 parts per million. Both units show a temperature of 71.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This number here represents the relative humidity. The next picture is a few days later. Both CO2 meters are inside closed plastic containers. The CO2 in my office that day was higher than previously. The air in container A is what was in my office that day, at 1,757 parts per million, with a temperature reading of 75.2 degrees. Container B has 8,356 parts per million, over 4 times what is in Unit A, with a temperature of 75.2 degrees, the same as Container A. About an hour and a half later, the CO2 level in Container B has dropped to 7,615 parts per million of CO2, but the temperature is still the same as in Container A, 75.2 degrees. 4 hours later, the CO2 level in Container B is still over twice that in Container A, but the temperature in both containers is still the same, now at 78.8 degrees. You can see that I don't have air conditioning in my office, and it can get quite warm by the end of the day. The point here is that both containers warmed up during the day, but neither one warmed up more than the other. The higher level of CO2 in Container B had no effect. Later, I decided to use glass containers and add a digital thermometer to each container just for additional temperature data. Here you can see the CO2 in Container A is 841 parts per million at 77.0 degrees, with the additional digital thermometer showing a temperature of 75.0 degrees. At the same time, here is Container B with 2,867 parts per million of CO2 with the same temperature readings. 2 days later, the temperature in both containers is still the same in each one, now at 73.4 degrees, while the CO2 in Container B has dropped to 1,548 parts per million, but is still almost twice as high as Container A. I'm going back to Container A and now to Container B again so that you can compare them. Next, I decided to put both containers outside. Both containers are in the shade, side by side, on a cabinet in my backyard under a covered area. Here is Container A with 514 parts per million of CO2 at 60.8 degrees. Here is Container B with 5,539 parts per million of CO2 at 60.8 degrees. 6 days later, here is Container A with 487 parts per million of CO2 at 78.8 degrees. And here is Container B with 1,169 parts per million of CO2 and the same temperature of 78.8 degrees. Notice that the digital thermometer actually shows the temperature of container B with over twice the amount of CO2 as container A at 76.6 degrees, while the digital thermometer in container A is about half a degree warmer than that in container B, even though it has higher CO2. So here we have the higher CO2 container actually a half a degree cooler. 10 days later, I ran the same experiment again. Here's container A with 482 parts per million of CO2 at 75.2 degrees, and container B with 4,654 parts per million of CO2, also at 75.2 degrees. This is 10 days later. Another day later, both containers have the same temperature, with container B still having about 5 times more CO2 than container A. This time the digital thermometers are showing the same temperature for both containers. Another day later, both containers still have the same temperature, with container B now having over twice the amount of CO2 as container A. The temperature in both containers is 69.8 degrees. These pictures show that much higher levels of CO2 in the container did not make any difference in the temperature inside the containers. Does this experiment prove that CO2 does not cause global warming? I make no such claim. I am only demonstrating the results of this single experiment using these specific instruments. There may or may not be other ramifications regarding these data, but that is outside the limits of this experiment. Now here are some possible weaknesses of this experiment. Maybe I have manipulated the data. Perhaps you think that I purposefully changed the data to give a specific result. You don't know me, so it might be possible that you think I'm committing some sort of fraud. If you think that might be the case, then I encourage you to get your own instruments and run this experiment yourself. Weakness number 2. Maybe the instruments are not accurate. That is, of course, possible. The total investment for all of these items was about $250. I don't know if more expensive instruments are more accurate. Weakness number 3. Maybe I'm using the wrong kind of CO2. The easiest way to get CO2 is simply to exhale into the container. This is what I did for this experiment. It could be that CO2 from other sources has vastly different properties. Weakness number 4. After several days in each case, the CO2 level in container B had decreased. I don't know why this happens, but there might be a number of reasons. It could be that since CO2 is heavier than some of the other gases in the air, that the CO2 molecules fall to the bottom of the jar where they might not be detected by the sensor in the instrument. It could also be that CO2 is escaping from the jar. I don't know if CO2 molecules are small enough to go through the glass or the metal lid. CO2 might also be escaping through the hole I made in the lid of the jar to connect the instrument to the power source. I sealed the holes in both lids with silicone gel, but it is possible that some CO2 escapes from there. There might be other weaknesses with this experiment. I encourage skeptical inquiry into this experiment. I also encourage as many as are interested to purchase your own instruments and run this experiment yourself. I think it would be great to have this experiment repeated thousands of times all over the world. As I said earlier, I make no claim as to whether CO2 in the air causes or does not cause global warming. That is certainly a discussion worth having. Based on the data from this experiment, it appears that high amounts of CO2 in the air make no difference in the temperature of the air. As always, I encourage a fact-based discussion of the results of this experiment.